Okay, so the only announcement that I really have is we have exam 5 coming up next week. And for that, just to reiterate, I'm allowing a note card to be used on that for the equations because you will be having to do some calculations. So it's a little different than the cheat sheet we had for exam 3. This one you cannot write absolutely anything on. I want it just the equations so that you can reference them and don't have to memorize the equations, but then no extra notes are allowed on that note card. Um, with that, I'll go ahead and I will turn it over to the group. If we have any questions or any topics we want to go over. Okay, so yeah, we can go over the learning objectives. I think that's a good use of our time for sure. So why don't we just jump right in? So the first one talks about define succession and recognize serial stages ranging from primary stage to climax stage. And I want to say one thing real quick about this question is Cogbooks only really talked about 2 stages, right? The pioneer species stage and the climax community. So there's not going to be a list of serial stages that you'll be responsible for knowing. You just have to know kind of the beginning and the end. So why don't we let's start with defining succession. So how do we define that? Yeah, so in the chat, a change in species composition. I would say that's definitely a great start to the answer. There's this a little bit, one extra piece of information that would go with the definition. Yeah, exactly. So just for full definition, a process where a community changes species composition over time. And then I mentioned pioneer species and climax community. So why don't we go ahead and define those? What do I mean when I'm saying pioneer species? Yeah, so the first species, exactly, the first species to arrive on site, so the earliest species. And we'll get into some of their characteristics in a little bit because there's another question that has us describe all of them, so we don't have to do that right now. But then conversely, what do we mean when we say climax community? Sure, we're going over the learning and topics and objectives, and we're on the first question. So right now we're trying to define a climax species or climax community. So we said that, okay. Yeah, so it's the last succession. So we said the last succession that sticks out of the 3 mechanisms. Uh, I'm not sure what you mean by the 3 mechanisms, but it is the final serial stage of succession. Maybe I'm missing something. Do you want to maybe add on to what you meant by the 3 mechanisms? If not, that's okay too. just to reiterate, right, we have pioneer species. They're just the first species to arrive. And then climax community is the final serial stage in the process of succession. So the last species to emerge from that community. All right. So I think that pretty much takes care of number one, defining succession and recognizing, the pioneer and climax serial stages. So why don't we move on to number two, and that says analyze experimental evidence of succession and identify the mechanisms that drive changes from one serial stage to the next. So can anybody remember any of the experiments that Cogbooks talked about where they were looking at testing for succession or measuring succession?
I'm so sorry. Could you repeat that? My video link did not go through.
Sure. So this one's asking us to analyze experimental evidence of succession and identify the mechanisms that drive changes from one serial stage to the next. So what I got from this question really is it's asking us to think about some experiments that Cogbooks talked about and what were the mechanisms that they found to be driving succession. All right, so someone said there's an experiment about spruce trees, and I would agree. I have that in my notes. What did they do in this experiment? They planted spruce trees, but how did they go about doing it? So it's that they observed germination success. Yeah, right. They planted the spruce trees and seedlings in the four serial stages that they found at Glacier Bay, right? So they labeled and recognized that there were different serial stages and planted spruce seedlings in all of the serial stages and looked at how well they did and which serial stage of the spruce stages do better in. In the later stage, right? Because they're trees. So they got outcompeted by some of the fast growing grasses and shrubs in the early serial stages, but did pretty well in where they were found in their later stages. What's another study that they did? Does anybody remember the study about the intertidal species or the intertidal communities? Where they recognized that different successional stages existed. What did they do what was the manipulation in that experiment? They didn't add anything, but they kind of did the opposite, right? They scraped the rocks. They removed species. So they went to different regions, removed certain species from that environment, kind of labeled or designated different regions, and then they looked at how succession occurred when they removed different species. So they acted kind of as a disturbance, and they looked at what if we remove species A, what happens to algae growth? What if we remove species B, does that affect algae growth? If we remove both species A and B, how does that affect algae growth and the different species, right? So there's different ways you can add species to a community and observe succession over time, or you could go in and disturb or remove communities and observe succession over time. And when they went into these intertidal zones and removed the different species, did they always see the same result? Did it end up with the same organization of species? No, right? Depending on which species they removed had different effects, and it had a particularly large effect on algae species. So those different barnacles sometimes helped algae, and removing other barnacles sometimes hindered algae growth. So having a disturbance doesn't always mean that you're going to get the exact same community that comes back. And knowing the mechanisms is just kind of knowing it's a removal process or it's an addition process and what the consequences of that are. Does removing a certain species hinder the regrowth of another species, or does it removing a certain species help the growth of other species? Right, so I think that covers number 2 pretty well. Just know some of the different experiments, what they did, and kind of how to interpret the results. You might see a figure possibly that asks you to interpret some type of result or something like that. So does anybody have any questions about number 2? All right, if not, I think we can move on to number 3. So number 3 says, identify forms of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in each component of an ecosystem. So this question really could be like several questions because it covers a lot of the Cogbooks materials from one of the from module 5. I think there's T21, and I would recommend going over all those activities a few times to practice. There was some email requests to go over some of these specific activities, so I'm going to go ahead and pull a few of these activities up. I have my notes real quick. All right, so can everybody see my screen right? So you might get on the exam is you're not going to get matching necessarily on the exam like this, but you might get some questions that you're going to have to know. You might get this picture and get asked what's happening in this picture, and then your multiple choice will be these questions. So that's more of how the exam is kind of formatted. So why don't we go through these and kind of talk through this example? So for the first one, if we say it says production of organic carbon, what do we think of when we hear that? And it gives us an example of C6H12O6. Does anybody remember what that is? So someone said plant cells. Now I would agree that that is the answer, but let's talk about why that's the answer. So in the plant cells, what mean are going to be this picture right here. We could connect that. Why does organic carbon, what does it have to do with plant cells? We think of food webs, what's on the bottom usually of the food web? The lowest level. So someone said they absorb it from the soil, but doesn't it say production? So it doesn't say absorption, right? So this is where organic carbon is coming from. On the lower side of the food chain, we have the producers, right? So plants absorb different chemical compounds, and then they produce this C6H12O6, which we can call glucose, right? So producers they're producing the food and essentially producing some of the sugars, which in this case would be a form of organic carbon because it has the C6 in the beginning of the chemical equation or the compound. So at the cellular level with plants, they're the producers and they're producing organic carbon. And this example would be in the form of sugars. Does that make sense? Okay, what about the next one? What do we think of when we think of consumption of organic carbon? Is there any picture that resembles consuming anything? Yeah, the monkey potentially, it's eating some sort of fruit there, right? So I think that one maybe be one of the more easy ones to recognize, right? And when we're using the words, production of organic and consumption of organic, that just means coming from a living thing, right? So we're consuming a living thing, being a fruit or whatever that is, assuming so a fruit's living, and then the production of organic carbon is coming from the living plant cells. And what about the next one? Decomposition of organic carbon. So being organic and decomposition, right? Something's dead, a living organism died and is decomposing. Which image associates with decomposition of organic carbon? Yeah, the dead animal picture, right? So I think that one's pretty straightforward. And then what about the next one? The circulation of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. It looks like we have the three pictures left look like three types of environments. So maybe a question to ask too is where would you expect to see high levels of CO2 and carbon monoxide? These are typically gases. Yeah, the top left picture. So when we say we have circulation, that's going to be a mixing of two environments, right? So we have up here, and this is outer space essentially, and then this is the edge of Earth's atmosphere. So you have the circulation of gases coming in and out of space. That would be the circulation of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. Conversely, where would we find the circulation of carbon dioxide with carbonic acid? And I'm not a chemist, so this isn't my strong suit, I'll say. So one way I think of this is when I think of any acid, really, I tend to think of liquids, because most acids are often in the times of liquid. So if we're circulating carbon dioxide, which we said is a gas, with carbon or carbonic acid, which is likely liquid form, or at least water soluble, which picture that we have left do you think would be a picture of circulation between the two? Yeah, the bottom right, where we have ocean waves or freshwater waves. So we have water coming in and turning over and mixing with the atmosphere. So there's got to be another thing with circulation is there's typically got to be some type of movement, right? So either you got to have the earth moving in space, or you got to have water rolling up on a shore here to have some type of circulation. All right, and the last one is storage of calcium carbonate, and our only choice left is this picture. But why is it the answer? What are we looking at in this picture, first of all, in the top right? And that's an aquatic environment, kind of like the bottom right picture, but what's different about it? Yeah, so it's underwater. I mean, not a lot of life living there. I would say that depends on the depth, but I think I know where you're going with it. It's a more stagnant sediment area, right? Where sediment settles. It's not, there's not a bunch of waves down there like on the surface. So what happens is you get carbon comes into the ocean or the freshwater and it can settle to the bottom. And if it gets underneath the sediment, it can then be stored as calcium carbonate. So when we hear the word storage of calcium carbonate, I'd say look at, for the bottom of the ocean or some hypoxic kind of environment where it would be underneath levels of sediment. Submit our answers and double check. Yeah, we got them all correct. All right. Let's try a couple of these. These are going to be important to know the reasoning for the exam. So this top one, so it's, this is the same one with some different pictures. So this should be, a little easier this time around, right? So we got production of organic carbon. So where is this organic carbon coming from? Yeah, the producers, exactly. The producers are going to be, this is an image of plant cells. So from the cellular level, what about consumption? Is there any consumption happening in these figures? Yeah, the bird. And just to make sure we're on the same page, it's got a worm in its mouth. So it's eating an organic living organism. And what about decomposition of organic carbon, right? We said it's a dead animal. Which one is the dead animal? The dead fish, right? Exactly. Then circulation of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. Remember what we said about those? Yeah, so the air, atmosphere. So these are typically CO2 and CO, carbon monoxide, are in gaseous form in the environment. So that would be here in the edge, in the atmosphere where gas exchange is occurring. And then we've got another circulation question again about carbon dioxide and carbonic acid. Remember, trying to think of carbonic, the acids as a liquid, So this would be, one of the water pictures, but what needs to be happening with the water. It has to be circulating, right? So movement. Which one of the water pictures looks like it has some movement? Yeah, the top right, we can see, the waves coming in, right? And then the storage of calcium carbonate looks like somebody's on the bottom of the bottom of a lake or the bottom of the ocean floor where there's sediment that's settling, and buried in there is going to be calcium carbonate. All right, that one is correct. And then just so we can see it in a little bit different form, you might get the opposite questions where you have the chemical equation and you're asked to understand what's going on here. So it's the same idea, but there is one different picture on here, right? We've got this picture, which is fire and some type of furnace. So let's go through and describe what's happening. When we have CO2 converting into or CO converting into CO2, so carbon monoxide going to carbon dioxide, what does that mean in terms of these pictures? So remember what we went over just prior to that. So it's the same idea, but just a different way of visually seeing it. Yeah, right. We have two gases that one gas is converting into another gas. So this would be circulation of gases. So that would be the atmosphere picture again, right? And then we have CO2, carbon dioxide, and then we have the C6H12O6. Does anybody remember what that is? I agree the answer is producers, but what is that in the equation? You don't need to know exactly the name of the chemical compound, but what did the previous, yeah, it's glucose, that's exactly correct. But to even simplify it, you could call it organic carbon, right? So this is CO2 being converted into organic carbon, or the production of organic carbon. And that comes from the cell picture. But what about now when we have organic carbon converted into CO2? What is that? Are we going from a complex compound to a simple compound, or a simple compound to a complex compound? So, well, which okay, we have an answer of simple, but is simple first or second in that equation? Second, right. So we're going from a complex compound to a simple compound. So what's another way of saying that? What's happening to the complex compound? Yeah, it's being broken down, exactly. So this is, from the examples, this is the breakdown of organic carbon into a simpler form. And which picture would be associated with the breakdown of organic carbon? I see where you're going with that. Someone said the monkey picture. Um, Technically, you could argue that if the food that has already been consumed is being broken down. So there is some truth to that. But let's think of this in terms of best answer. Is there a potential better answer for the breakdown of organic carbon here? Yeah, the dead animal. So the breakdown of organic carbon would be decomposition, right? I'd argue that that would be correct. But what about fire? That's combustion. Isn't that also where you take wood or fuel and you break it down into a simpler compound? So why would it be the dead animal and not the fire? The simple answer is because chemistry. Is there another answer on the board that is the breakdown of organic carbon? Yeah, the last one is the breakdown of organic carbon, right? But it breaks down into different compounds. It breaks down into carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So there's two products that come out of this. And this one is just because how chemistry happens with fire, it's going to produce multiple gases because it breaks down slightly different than the decomposition process. If we go back to this one, somebody said earlier in the note or in the chat that it could be the monkey, and I would agree, right? It could be thinking about it more. That is, the consumption is also the breakdown chemically of organic carbon. So you can have possibly multiple answers. So why don't we just list it as both and see what Cogbooks tells us? All right, and how about this one where we have CO2 being converted into H2CO3? So what are we talking about with H2CO3? So it is going to be important to know kind of what these chemical compounds are. So this is a form of acid, right? This is going to be carbonic acid. So if we have a gas exchange with an acid exchange, what would that be as far as the pictures? So we're thinking gas and acid, gas and liquid. Yeah, the ocean waves. I would agree. Then here, what do we have going on? We have CaCO3, which is calcium carbonate, right? To HCO3, which is another form of, this is bicarbonate. And if we talk about calcium carbonate in our previous examples, where is calcium carbonate usually stored and broken down? Yeah, in the sediment. So it's going to be, like the ocean floor, the bed of the lake. All right. I think I did the wrong. Oh no, we already, no, never mind. We're good. Let's submit those and see what we get. Yeah, so that is correct. And just to reiterate, in the chemical equation, the breakdown of organic matter could be decomposition. It could equally be the consumption of organic matter. So it could have two choices possibly. All right. Let's try another one. Skip ahead a little bit. So you might get questions on the exam that look more similar to these in the structure. So for the first one, it says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more carbon in the form of C6H12O6? Remember, we're saying that's organic carbon. So where are we going to find organic carbon? A is the picture of an animal, so inside that animal, and B is kind of like the atmosphere, so just in the air in general. Where would we expect to find more organic carbon? Someone said A, I would agree. Let's talk about briefly why is there more organic carbon in an animal than in the air? When we talked about the word organic had to do with a living organism, right? So being an animal, that's a living organism, versus B is the air, that's not really a living organism. So organic carbon is going to be found in higher levels inside a living organism. All right, what about number 2 here? So it says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more carbon in the form of CaCO3? Remember, that's calcium carbonate. But where do you think we would find more calcium carbonate? In A, which looks to be a body of water, or B, again, the air or a part of the atmosphere? So someone says A, I would agree. But again, let's talk about why is that? Well, okay, you said because it's circulating, but in the previous examples, we found it in the bottom of like lakes or the bottom of the ocean where we had minimal circulation down in the sediment. So this one is, I'm not trying to be tricky about it, but with thinking the chemistry, calcium carbonate is what, water soluble. So it's something that we would tend to find, it's something we would find in the water. We usually wouldn't, maybe we'd find some of it at the surface because it is water soluble when CO2 goes into the water, but we'd find even more of it at the bottom of this river, I bet. But just comparing the air versus water, water has a higher level, and deeper in the water, towards the bottom of where we have our sediment, we'd have the highest levels. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Well, I'm not doing a great job of hiding the answers, but we can talk about the whys. So it says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more carbon in the form of CO? So that's carbon monoxide. And this says, refer to figure 2. Are we going to find it more carbon monoxide in the water or in the air? Now, obviously, the answer is B because you can see it. But why do we find more carbon monoxide in the air versus the water? What form do we typically find carbon monoxide in the environment? Yeah, exactly. It's a gas. So if it's going to be stable as a gas at most temperatures, we're going to find it in highest levels in the air. Now, is there carbon monoxide in the water? Sure, absolutely, but it's just higher levels in the air because it's a gas. All right, and number 4 says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more carbon in the form of H2CO3? And that's carbonic acid. And it says refer to figure 2. So are we going to find more carbonic acid in A, in the stream here, or B, in the air in the atmosphere? In the stream, I would agree. And why is that? What do we talk about when we talk about acids? What forms do they tend to be in? Liquid, right? So if we have a lot of acids that are in liquid form, are they going to be liquids floating through the air? Are they going to be liquids flowing through water? And we said the answer was A, so I think the answer is liquids tend to be in liquids. So you're going to find more acids formed in waters than you are going to find them in the atmosphere. Probably be pretty hard pressed to actually find some of these acids anywhere in the atmosphere. All right, and then number 5 says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more carbon in the form of CO2? For the stream or the air, and you can see the answer is B. But why are we going to find more CO2 in the air or atmosphere than we are going to find it in the water? The way I would approach it is to think about the structures of the compounds. You know, what is carbon dioxide? It's a gas, right? So where do we tend to find more gases? In the air or in liquids? Yeah, exactly. Find more gases in the air. And can you make the argument again that there's CO2 in the water? Absolutely. But if you take measurements, on average, you're going to find more in the air than you are going to find in bodies of water. All right, let's skip ahead a little bit and try one from the nitrogen cycle. I think we got a handle a little bit on what's going on with carbon, but now the nitrogen cycle activities were the kind of the exact same. And some of these answers are going to be very similar. So if we understand carbon a little bit, this should make understanding nitrogen a little easier. There are some differences, and we can talk about those. So now we talk about assimilation. So assimilation of ammonium or nitrate. What do we mean by assimilation, first of all? And this is a recurring theme, so assimilation is good to know because you're going to have to calculate some assimilation problems in later modules too, and on the exam. The percentage of consumed energy, I would agree that that's a perfect start, but there's two more words or one more word that you could add on to that. It definitely has to do with the consumed energy. What happens to energy that we consume? Say we eat a meal. What happens to that entire meal? Does it take the exact same path? all parts of that meal? No, right? What happens to it? There's two main paths that it takes to really simplify it. So someone said some gets digested and the other turns into energy. And I would say, yeah, it's definitely, we're definitely getting there. It definitely, some of it definitely gets digested, but I would argue that what gets digested is what turns into energy. What happens to the food that, well, I guess, okay, let me back up a step. Generally, it all does get digested. You're correct. Some of it turns into energy after digestion, and some of it does what? The food that's not converted into energy. What happens to that? Yeah, I mean, we're biologists, we can talk about it. You poop it out or you pass it, right? So you either absorb it in the form of energy or you pass it in the form of waste, right? So those are the two paths of food takes when we ingest it. So when we talk about assimilation, which path is that talking about? The food that we absorb or the food that we pass? Yeah, the food that we absorb. So getting back to the first choice here, assimilation of ammonium or nitrate. So that just means absorption of ammonium or nitrate. Where would we be absorbing food in these pictures? And based on the activity, because we have to drop and drag, there's only going to be one choice. So someone said the lion, and I could see why we would think that, right? Because eventually the food that it's eating, it is going to assimilate some of that in order to survive. But I think there's a better choice in the choices we have here in the list. So that would be this one with the lion would be consumption of organic nitrogen. Because you're at this stage, the lion is just consuming it, hasn't necessarily absorbed it or assimilated it yet. And when we think of assimilation in terms of nitrogen, it's going to be at the cellular level because the plants are what absorb ammonium and nitrate from the soils. So I understand these two are very similar, but understanding the difference is important here, right? Plants, you think, absorb food through their roots. They don't really consume it. They don't have a mouth and a digestive tract, but rather they absorb it or assimilate it right away. Where an animal like a lion has a mouth and has a digestive tract, so it's going to consume its food first and then absorb it. That makes sense, the difference between these two pictures and the nitrogen cycle? Okay. What about the next one? Mineralization of organic nitrogen. What do we think of when we say mineralization? Yeah, breaking down compounds. I completely agree. Which one of these images do we think has to do with breaking down compounds? The dead animal. Yep, I would agree with that. So mineralization, you can kind of associate that with decomposition. So it's the breaking down, but it's called mineralization just based on which chemical compounds are involved. All right, what about nitrification of ammonium? What do we mean by nitrification? Because the next term is denitrification. So it seems like they're a process of some sort, and one is going in one direction and one is going in the opposite direction. So what do we create through nitrification? What is ammonium going to get converted into? Yeah, nitrite or nitrate. So it's going to convert it into, say, nitrites of some sort. So if we're taking one compound and breaking it down into potentially multiple simpler compounds, it's similar to mineralization, but it's very specific. So which picture is this associated with? And maybe what organisms are responsible for nitrification? They're in the picture, but you just can't see them because they're pretty small. Smaller than, well, this is a zoomed in picture, so this might actually technically be the smallest picture. But there's a picture that does contain small living organisms that we just can't see, but we can see the product. Since at the bottom right, what are we looking at the bottom right, first of all? Does anybody remember what that is? I agree, it's a living organism, so that's a fair guess. It looks like fungi. There might be some fungi there, but what that is, it's a type of, that's a root from some plant. I don't know what it is, but this is a root system. So that we can see with the naked eye. So what I'm looking for is a living organism that we can't see with the naked eye. It's on the level of fungi. Yeah, bacteria. Where do we find bacteria? I think the simple answer is everywhere, but where does it generally? Yeah, soil, right? And it generally comes from the soil, even though you can swab basically any surface and find bacteria. But for this, it's in high numbers in soils. And what it is, if it's breaking a soil down, we have this soil over here and this soil over here. Which soil looks like bacteria has done some nitrification or breaking down of compounds? This loose looking soil or this clumpy looking soil? Yeah, so the loose soil. So what happens during nitrification is it breaks the ammonium down with the bacteria into simpler compounds, and it actually makes more fertile soil. Because you have an anaerobic environment, there's lots of oxygen there that the bacteria can live and actually do the nitrification process. Conversely, we have denitrification, which is the opposite process, right? Where we have nitrates and nitrites that are being converted into, or not being broken down, or maybe converted into ammonium. And that's going to take place in more anaerobic environments. So maybe in swamps or in the bottom of marshes or clay soil like this, where it's not very breathable, that the microbes and the bacteria don't persist there in good numbers, so it doesn't really break down the soil, and it's usually in larger chunks, and it's not very good quality soil, at least far for like plants. So way I think about this, and I don't know if it's maybe the best way, but nitrification is the breakdown, so you have the looser soil, breathable soil, good aerated soil, versus denitrification is the opposite, right? So you have kind of clumpier, non-breathable, and not very good usable soil for producers. So a more anaerobic environment. Now, what about the next one? Fixation of nitrogen gas. What happens in this process when during fixation, particularly for nitrogen gas? Where do we find N2 generally? Is that in the soil? Is that in the air? Is that in water? It says nitrogen gas, right? Somebody said a vote for the top left picture. But before we get to that, where do we find nitrogen gas in the environment at higher levels? Yeah, in the air. So if it's fixation of nitrogen gas, what that means is it has to pull nitrogen gas from the air and fixate it, right? And by fixating it, it means like pulling it into another compartment, or what do you want to call it? Try not to use the word in the picture, sorry, but it affixes to something, it becomes stuck or bound to it. Or in a sense here, it's actually a conversion factor. So it's converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms that producers can use. And what do we think about when we talk about producers? Plants and roots, somebody said, right? So do we have anything that looks like plants or roots in this picture? I mean, arguably we have two, but we already put an answer up for one. Yeah, so the bottom right, where the fixation of nitrogen gas occurs is in plant roots. So, and this uses fungi. So this is like a mutualistic kind of relationship with the fungi and the plant roots in order to convert this nitrogen gas from the atmosphere into more usable forms so that the plants can use it and so that the fungi can use it. So that would go here. And then this is the release of nitric oxide. And the only answer we have is the fire. So if we put that there, but I'm going to ask why. Why is the release of nitric oxide occurring because of fire? What's happening to nitrogen? What we could say, what happens to organic nitrogen in a fire? What happens to anything in a fire? It's flammable. Does a fire build things up? Does it break them down? Yeah, it breaks them down. And when you break things down, it releases it in simpler forms, right? So then it can release it in the form of nitric oxide. So that's all it's meant by that picture. And then let's take one example here, because these are going to be similar to what you see on the exam again. So I just want to make sure we have some practice together. So let's talk about the whys of these, right? So the first one says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more nitrogen in the form of NO, nitric oxide, A or B? So will you find nitric oxide in the water or will you find it in the air? What is, I mean, so we just think about what is the form of nitric oxide, right? We said it came from a fire in the form of a gas. So where do we expect to, find gases? more in the environment, in the air, than we do in liquids, right? Similarly, number 2, so it says, which of these parts of the ecosystem contain nitrogen in the form of NO3? And that's a nitrate. Why would we find NO3 more in water than we would in the air? It has to do with like the characteristic of nitrates. Nitrates are water soluble, so we tend to find them in higher numbers in water than we do in the air. And same idea with nitrogen in the form of NH4, which is ammonium, right? Ammonium is also water soluble, so you're going to tend to find more of it in the water than you are going to find it in the air. So in that information about some of these characteristics, it is in the reading parts where where it talks about how nitrogen cycles. There's a couple paragraphs that it'll mention which ones are more water soluble and which ones are not, and the same thing for the carbon cycle. Then let's go over just a little bit of about one of the activities from the phosphorus cycle. So these are all kind of the same idea, but understanding the whys, and they're a little bit different, is going to be important for the exam for sure. So the first one here says production of organic phosphorus. So which one of these pictures is showing production of some sort? And this one's going to be similar to the carbon cycle. The phosphorus is produced in a similar manner. Yeah, so in the plant cells, right? So we would have production of organic phosphorus here. What about consumption of organic phosphorus? Where is their consumption happening? Yeah, with the koala. The koala is eating presumably some eucalyptus leaves. And what about decomposition of organic phosphorus? Yep, the dead fish. I would definitely agree with that. Circulation of phosphate. So it's going to be similar to before, but we're missing kind of one picture here. What picture are we missing that was in the nitrogen, or rather was in the carbon cycle pictures? Does anybody remember? Because it has to do with one of the characteristics of phosphorus. Phosphorus is not found in the air very readily at all. It's almost exclusively in soil or water. So if we're looking for a circulation picture, we're missing the one that has like the picture from space, basically, where it's like the atmosphere meets space. So what other circulation picture do we have here, though, that would be related to phosphorus, particularly phosphate? Yeah, the beach. I'd argue it's not the best picture because it doesn't really show any whitecaps from the waves. There is a little bit of movement. Cogwicks could have done better here, but it is going to be the beach picture where the water meets the air. All right, what about storage of phosphate? We should have an idea of where to look for some chemical compound storage. Yeah, so underwater sediments is going to contain more than one type of compound, right? So we know we have calcium carbonate down there, but we're also going to have phosphate down there. And what about weathering of phosphate? So weathering, that's a new term that we haven't talked about in the other cycles. So what do we mean by weathering real quick? So something related to climate, I would absolutely agree. What's an example of weathering? We can think of everyday items that get weathered, right? So what happens when you leave, you have a deck, maybe say in the back of your house, and you paint it, it's made out of wood. Over time, does that deck kind of start to break down, right? You know, it gets, we call it getting weathered. What parts of the environment are causing it to break down? So someone said the oxygen, the temperature. I think those are on the right track. What causes fluctuations in temperature on Earth? Or what is our, where do we get most of our heat from, if we want to say it that way, if we're thinking of temperature changes? Yeah, the sun, right? So if your deck is out exposed to the sun, that's energy that's hitting it and it's beating it up, right? So you can get sun wear. That's a form of weathering. Maybe you put clothes out on a drying line in Arizona in the desert in the middle of the summer. If any of you have ever done that, you know that the sun can basically bleach your clothes. I learned that the hard way when I moved to Arizona. And it can, if you leave your clothes outside to dry too long, it actually ruins them. It weathers them very quickly. Essentially just breaks them down. What else from the weather can cause damage to the deck? Let's think of it that way. What from the environment can cause damage to that deck? We said the sun can cause damage. Rain. Yep, rain can absolutely cause damage. What else can cause damage? What do tornadoes produce? Wind, exactly, right? So there's different types of, when we think about weathering, it's just parts of the environment. So, you know, you can get weathering from sun damage, wind damage, water damage. So it could be direct rains, it could be runoff, it could be flooding. That's all types of weathering. So in this environment, of the two pictures we have left, what looks like an environment that's fairly weathered? Damaged by the environment. Yeah, the top left, right? We have these rocks here that likely are receiving all of what we talked about. They're in, you know, what looks to be a very sunny environment, so they're probably getting a lot of radiation, breaking parts of them down. If it rains, it looks like there's a lot of cuts in the side that could be from water runoff. And if they're in a very open area like this, they're probably getting a lot of wind damage too. So there's a lot of weathering going on in this picture. All right. And then now this one is where things maybe get a little confusing between the cycles. So it's a matter of keeping this straight. Assimilation is going to be associated with plant roots in the phosphorus cycle, because plants are going to suck up assimilation, or our plants are going to suck up phosphate via assimilation. So we just got to keep those straight, which one assimilation goes to in which cycles. And I think that'll just take a little bit of, you know, a little bit of practice going through these exercises and maybe making some flashcards with them or working with small groups practicing these. So I would highly recommend, you know, going through all of these activities maybe a few times and thinking about the whys and being able to explain them a little bit, because you might see these in a multiple choice question, a true false question, or there might be a short answer question associated, where you have to give an example, or it asks you a question and it has you explain the why, and you have to explain some of the mechanisms of what's going on in the event. All right, I think that's pretty good for, what are we on, number 3? Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and we can move on. Oh, that was, and then number 4 says predict the effect of adding carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus to a component of the ecosystem on the fluxes of these elements to their components of the ecosystem. So with that, those are going to be covered in the activities too. So that's essentially going to be the chemical equations. If you put like carbon monoxide with carbon dioxide, what are we going to get? And we saw what it can potentially produce. Or if we have organic carbon, and break it down, what pieces are going to come off of that? What is it going to break down into? What are their chemical elements or compounds? So 3 and 4 are very much the same. So I think we covered both of those pretty well. And then we can go on to number 5. So this says, explain how scientists identify hotspots of biodiversity. So there are a couple ways of doing this. What's one of the ways that scientists identify hotspots of biodiversity? And the way these questions are broken up, 1 through 4 are the first 3 modules that you did, and the rest of these are going to be pretty much associated with the last module, I believe. So, oh no, they're not. They're just out of order. The reason I bring that up is because we are going to have another office hours. I don't know if everybody has gotten through all the cogbooks at this point. We want to go ahead and skip the questions that are associated with the last module and go back to some of the ones from the earlier modules. And then on Tuesday during office hours, we can come back and cover whatever we don't finish tonight. Or do we want to, or there are people that have gone through it and want to go through all of them? I'll leave that, you guys can decide the group. Well, I'll definitely do Tuesday regardless, but if we're going to go through all of them today, I don't want to regurgitate and do the exact same thing on Tuesday. So we could break it up into pieces and just do some of the questions tonight and some of the questions on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, we can go over some examples. Okay, so we have 1 vote for breaking it up. Does anybody not want to break it up, I should say? I think breaking it up is a good idea because that'll give us a chance to finish over the weekend and on Monday as well. Because we are a little early because the exam isn't until what, Tuesday or Wednesday the exam is. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's break it up. We will then, for tonight, we'll bypass number 5. We'll bypass, I think, number 6. I guess the next question is, does anybody want to continue? Because this would not be a bad stopping place. Or do we want to call it a night? And then we'll just pick up right from here on Tuesday and finish it out. Okay, so someone said that they're gonna have to leave soon anyways. Someone else says they're gonna end. Yeah, so why don't we do that? Let's stop here. We covered a lot. I know we only technically got through 4 questions, but with all the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycle activities, that did take a while. So yeah, let's call it a night here, unless, I'll take questions if anybody has any specific questions they want to go over from, an activity or about the exam or about the course. I can stick around for a little while yet and field those questions. But yeah, we'll take a break on the learning topics for tonight, and we'll pick up with number 5 on Tuesday. So if anybody doesn't have any questions, feel free to hop off. And if anybody stays on, kind of expect that you have a question. And also, if you're going through the activities and something doesn't make perfect sense or you don't understand why, feel free to shoot me those questions through the support at the bottom of the page, and I can answer and field those questions individually. Even if you just want to test your knowledge and say, hey, I think it's A because of these reasons. Is that correct? I can tell you, yep, you're on track, or I can explain, maybe something you're missing. So, we still have plenty of time for that before the final exam. And also the final exam is not cumulative in the sense that it's not going to cover specific materials from the first 4 exams, but some of the concepts as you've seen are overlapping. Like we've talked about, assimilation a few times. We're going to be talking keystone species from the last exam is something that comes up again in for this exam. So just it builds on itself is the idea. But if there's no more questions, then all right, I think we can call it a night. I appreciate everybody for coming out and participating, and I will get this posted in a little bit. Everyone, have a good weekend.